can open that and have our meeting underway. Here we go. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mabel Elmore. I'm the MLA for Vancouver, Kensington, and the chair of the Special Committee to Review Passenger-Directed Vehicles. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining today's virtual meeting from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I encourage all committee members and our guests to consider the traditional territories where you are all located today. The committee is reviewing passenger-directed vehicle services and transportation network services, including taxis and ride-hailing administered under the Passenger Transportation Act. To support this, we're holding a public consultation to inform our work, and there are a couple ways British Columbians can get involved. Those interested in speaking with the committee at one of our upcoming public meetings can register by Friday, September 22nd, and I would encourage those interested to register. The committee will also begin accepting written materials starting next week. So that's another way you can provide input to committee members. All the information on how to participate can be found on the committee's website, www.leg.bc.ca/CMT/PDV. Today, we will be receiving briefings from the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, from the Passenger Transportation Board, the Ministry of Labor, and ICBC. Before we get started, I'd like to ask the committee members to introduce yourselves, and I'd like to start with our Deputy Chair.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, everyone. I'm Shirley Bond. I'm the MLA for Prince George Valemount and the Opposition Shadow Minister for Health.
Terrific. Next, Kelly Green.
Hi, I'm Kelly Green, MLA for Richmond Steaston.
Great. And now over to Jordan.
Good morning. I'm Jordan Sturdy, MLA for West Vancouver, Sea to Sky.
Thanks. And Janet.
Good morning. My name is Janet Rutledge. I'm the MLA for Burnaby North and Parliamentary Secretary for Labor.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to welcome our first guest this morning, and joining us for our presentation, our first presentation from the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. And we have, I think, joining us here, I see Kay Krishna, Deputy Minister, Steve Haywood, Executive Director and Registrar, Passenger Transportation, Jeremy Wood, Executive Director, Strategic Policy and Legislation. And I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Good morning.
I'll just mention that, thank you, apologies. So we'll have your presentation and then we'll have a period of question and answer following that. Thank you. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present to the special committee today. We're very pleased to be here. As you know, due to COVID, this committee has been delayed, and so we're very eager to have an update and share our progress on this very significant work that we've been endeavoring upon for the past several years. And thank you to the chair for the introductions. I won't repeat the introductions. I will note that we're all in the same room together, but just on different computers so that you can see us. And hopefully that doesn't create an issue with sound. But anyway, we are pleased to be joining you here today. And we are joining from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people known today as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And we're all quite pleased and proud and grateful for the opportunity to work and live on these lands. So, will someone be presenting my slides, or what is the process for that?
Okay, Kay, do you have a slide deck to present?
We do, yeah. We have slides that I think were submitted as part of our submission.
Okay, Jennifer?
So the members all have access to the material, so they'll be able to see. So if you do reference a particular slide, members are able to follow along, but there will not be screen sharing today.
Okay, great. So all of my speaking is directly to the slides. So if you have the slides, I appreciate if you can pull them up, and we'll go slide by slide as I present, if that works for you. And some of the slides have quite a bit of data and other things, so hopefully you're able to see them. And if not, please let me know if you have questions, or we can go back at the end. So I'll jump right in. We have a number of materials to go through with you this morning. We appreciate the opportunity again to be here. Really two major components of our agenda today. So I'm on slide 2. First is we'll provide an overview of the model that we have here in BC, which has often been referred to as the Made in BC model. And we'll go through really the broad strokes of the legislative and regulatory framework, the key elements of that, and how it shaped and really informed the program to date. And then in the second part of the presentation, we'll focus on the implementation of the framework. So our goal really is to provide an overview of what we put in place, how the framework was established, and then provide some baseline information for all of you as the committee. I believe this is your first presentation to really help ground you in the key elements of the program to help establish your baseline understanding of what's been put in place. So on to slide 3. Before I jump into the two key areas of the material, I wanted to first provide some grounding terms so that everybody is clear and on the same page of what we're referring to when we refer to TNSs and PDVs and some of the other language. So I would like to note first that taxi and ride hail do not appear in the legislation. Instead, we have the word, the phrase transportation network services, or TNS, which is really on-demand transportation services, so ride-hailing services, for compensation provided through a technology platform by companies licensed under the Act. So taxi and ride-hail vehicles are broadly defined as passenger-directed vehicles, or PDVs, in the Passenger Transportation Act. And these are vehicles for hire operating under a license, and PDVs also include other types of vehicles for hire, such as limousines, for example. And a licensee is the company that is authorized to provide the transportation services for compensation. So taxi and TNS companies must hold a special authorization license, and the decision to approve the license and the application rests with the Passenger Transportation Board, who I believe is presenting after us. So with that, I'll move into the first section of the agenda, which is starting on slide 4, the legislative and regulatory framework of the Made in BC model. So going into slide 5 for our guiding principles. So the legislation, which is really key around Bill 55, is the principal bill to reference here, is shaped by the key principles that you can see on the slide. I won't read all of them, but the goal really and the focus of the Made in BC model was to modernize taxi services and to enable ride hailing. So really looking at both taxis and ride hailing on balance, and trying to bring them into kind of the current situation in today's market in BC. So the guiding principles that shaped the program were informed by two key inputs in 2018. So first was Dr. Dan Hara provided a report entitled Modernizing Taxi Regulation. And that was a pivotal input that shaped the legislation, and it was grounded in research from other jurisdictions, but also research here in BC. And then the second key principle that shaped, or key input that shaped the principles, was the first Select Standing Committee on Crown Corporations report on transportation network services. The BC model intended to strike a balance between meeting the consumer demand for more transportation options and also supporting competitive taxi and TNS industries. So a key goal that we tried to really achieve was also learning from other jurisdictions and experiences elsewhere. So for example, we saw at the time and continue to see TNSs in other jurisdictions causing challenges with passenger safety or raising concerns around passenger safety, and challenges in urban areas with a lot of congestion or perceived excess congestion. And then on the taxi side of things, the concerns that we saw in other jurisdictions was really around the disruption to the industry as a result of the ride hailing emerging in different jurisdictions. Moving on to slide 6. So Bill 55 was introduced in November of 2018. It amended 8 statutes to set the framework that we have in place today. So there are 3 broad categories of changes to 8 different statutes. So the first is around the broad category of licensing, safety, compliance, and enforcement. So this applied to existing passenger transportation board license applications to TNS, and then new compliance and enforcement tools applied equally to taxi and the TNS companies. The second category of changes was around enabling a new distance-based insurance product, and that was established for TNS business model, and then changes could be enabled for a similar product for taxis if desired. And then the third category is around removing the principal authority to municipal authority to limit the passenger transportation board decisions. Prior to this legislation, there were different jurisdiction authorities within municipalities. So some examples of what this addressed was some municipalities were refusing to allow additional taxis to operate that the board had approved. So there was a disconnect between what the passenger transportation board had authorized versus what the municipality was authorizing. And what the third category thought to do was to make PT board decisions equitable and consistent across the province. Moving on to slide 7. And there will be a kind of a series of slides here on the different roles and responsibilities established, two slides. So the first is really focusing on the roles of the 2 key regulators supported by Bill 55. So one is the registrar. That's within the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. And that's a registrar for, it's administrative. It focuses on compliance and enforcement within our ministry. That's for all commercial vehicles. It's not, and passenger-directed vehicles is not just for taxis and ride-hailing or TNSs, but it's the registrar of commercial vehicles. And so it also focuses on compliance, as I mentioned, and enforcement. And it's really, the role didn't change significantly through this. It just extended the authorities of the regulator to TNS companies and drivers. The second area of responsibility was with the Passenger Transportation Board. Again, the PTB existed well before Bill 55, but the additions were to add key features to the board in making decisions on TNS license applications. And the board's existing 3-part test was also extended to TNS organizations. So the 3-part test for passenger-directed vehicles was if the applicant is fit and proper. Second, if there's a public need for the proposed service. And third, if an application is approved, would it promote sound economic conditions for the passenger transportation industry? So that's the 3-part test that the PT board was applying previously to other PDBs, and then it was extended to TNS. So that role was just expanded, much like the registrars. And then finally, the PT board was provided with significant policy setting role for TNSs, the responsibility for setting rates, supply, and boundaries for TNS licenses, which is the same responsibility that they had as a regulator for the taxi licenses. Moving on to slide 8, roles and responsibilities beyond the provincial regulating roles. First is around municipal authorities. So as I mentioned previously, we reduced some of the responsibilities and authorities of municipalities. We also changed the regulatory burden for taxi drivers, where they needed previously a permit from each municipality they operated in. So we changed the requirement for authority to impose supply and boundary limitations, and also remove the authority for municipal chauffeur permits. Next, for insurance, the insurance products that I previously mentioned, we added a new distance-based product for passenger-directed vehicles operating under the TNS license. Moving on to slide 9. So I'm going to walk through a number of key elements for the legislative framework, and I'll start first with safety and promoting safety. So the key provincial requirements for Bill 55 and the regulations were for road passenger safety, and they were applied equally to taxis and TNSs. So first, there's a vulnerable sector check So it's the most comprehensive form of a criminal record check required for all passenger-directed vehicle drivers, so for taxis and TNS drivers. There's also a Class 4 commercial class of driver's license, and it's required for taxi and limousine drivers, and which was maintaining that, and then extending that requirement of a Class 4 license to TNS drivers. Then on the National Safety Code front, taxi licensees were required to operate under the same National Safety Code. And so we placed that same requirement on the TNS licensees. So for example, the requirements to receive a mandatory vehicle inspection that are around that are required by the National Safety Code. So we extended that to the TNS vehicles as well. Next, the next key element is around compliance and enforcement. Moving on to slide 10. So we bolstered the safety requirements with changes to the registrar's compliance and enforcement tools. So we added an auditing authority to be applied to the TNS licenses. So the auditing authority was applied to taxis, and we extended that to TNS licensees. And then we added administrative monetary penalties. We increased them for non-compliance of licensees. So from a maximum of $1,500 to $50,000. We also added new penalties for illegal operators and drivers. This was a major concern for different constituencies for TNS or ride-hailing operators operating without a license, as well as a concern for the taxi industry and an issue that was happening in other jurisdictions. And so there were penalties for unlicensed operators, and those were increased. So there were new offenses and substantial penalties added for individual and corporate PDs for services who are operating without a license. So in other words, illegal ride hail, as many people refer to it. The next element, a key element of the framework, moving on to slide 11, is evidence-based decision-making. This was a very significant shift from how auditing and tracking and management of PDVs had occurred previously, and it was a shift for the industry as well. And so, but as most folks will know, the ride-hailing industry is really data-driven and data-enabled, and so it was really critical for all of us to be able to have access to data and evidence-based decision-making. And this is an area that is continuing to mature. So our model recognized the need for data to really support our decision-making, but also the Passenger Transportation Board's decision-making. It's also really critical for compliance and enforcement. So Bill 55 established a new term and condition of licensing for taxi and TNS companies to provide trip-related data to the registrar. So that's the ministry's registrar. And the requirement necessitated that we, the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, build a data warehouse and work with industry to establish processes for data submissions. And we'll provide a little bit more information on that momentarily when I get to the implementation area. Moving on to slide 12, another key area, or the final key area of the legislative framework, is around accessibility, not just protecting, but really expanding available accessible vehicles for hire. So Bill 55 included a per trip fee for TNS licensees. Part of modernizing the framework was really to provide this per trip revenue to help cover all of the new program elements that were established by modernizing the framework and including TNS licensees in the framework. So the new fee helped to cover things like compliance and enforcement staff, really having to expand that staff base across the province. The new technology system, which was very significant investment, and also to help, most importantly, we think, really to help keep wheelchair accessible taxis operating, and to actually incentivize and expand wheelchair accessible taxis. So wheelchair accessible vehicles are a requirement of taxi companies. They are more expensive to equip, maintain, and operate compared to a standard taxi or a TNS vehicle. So for example, it costs at least $40,000 more to purchase a wheelchair accessible vehicle and approximately $30,000 more a year to maintain and operate than a standard taxi. So the fee originally started out at 30 cents, and in January this year, government supported an increase to that fee to 90 cents, which helped to offset some of the fees and the costs of the program that I mentioned, but also has enabled our ability to launch the PTAP, which is a Passenger Transportation Accessibility Program, which we launched earlier this year, and which I'll speak to momentarily. So I'll just pause there to say that that's really the overview of the legislative framework and the enabling framework and structures that we've put in place for modernizing ride-hailing and the Made in BC model. And now what I'll do is turn to the second component of the agenda and really talk about the implementation of the model. And Chair, should I proceed, or would you like me to pause at this point? I'll proceed, and then we'll take questions at the end. Okay, very good, thank you. So slide 14, I just wanted to highlight some of the key events in the timeline of the implementation. So in August 2019, so as I mentioned, it was brought forward, the Bill 15 was brought forward in November 2018. In August 2019, the Passenger Transportation Board set operational policies for TNSs, or Transportation Network Services. And through that, the PT Board established 5 TNS regions, which you can see on the map, the small map. They also established no supply or fleet size limits for TNSs. And they determined that TNS rates were based on a minimum taxi flag rate in the operating area. So for example, in TNS Region 1, which is Metro Vancouver, at the time, $3.35 is the minimum price for a TNS license, that a TNS licensee may charge. And that was, again, based on taxi flag rates. Also, and then following that sort of policy establishment that was published in August 2019. In September of 2019, the board started accepting TNS license applications, and Bill 55 and the accompanying regulations came into force shortly thereafter. So I'll note on this timeline, it's not listed, but I'll also note that the program really in earnest started at the end of 2019, and then of course COVID hit in early March 2020, and so there wasn't a lot of time for the program to launch and really get going before COVID hit, and obviously had a very significant impact on the implementation as well as the uptake and the market independent of this program, but the market for taxis and the transportation sector was hit very significantly by COVID, and we'll talk about that shortly, but that's not on the timeline. I'll just note it that only a few months later, COVID then hit. So moving on to slide 15, funding and resources. So there was initial budget established when the program launched, and over the past few years, we have been provided a significant increase to funding both for the ministry and the Passenger Transportation Board through Treasury Board. And so the funding has increased to help support both the implementation and the overall regulation and data. So the increases in, you can see the budget from 2018 and 19, for example, for the ministry was 1.08 or 1.1 rounding up million. And then at the same time in 2018-2019 budget, it was about $500,000 for the PT board. Since then, based on increasing staff across the province, adding and expanding the IT systems, and then also ongoing work and staffing increases for the PT board, the ministry's budget has since increased so that the current budget for 23-24 for MODI was 5.5 million, and for the Passenger Transportation Board, that has been increased to 2.5 million approximately. Moving on to slide 16, the data warehouse. So the Passenger Transportation Data Warehouse was, as I mentioned previously, a very significant undertaking. It's quite advanced data warehouse and analytics tool that the ministry put in place. It was a fairly significant change endeavor for both, not just the ministry, but also the market and the taxi companies and operators. And so, as I mentioned in Bill 55, there was a requirement for trip data to be collected from both taxis and TNS operators. What we have seen, and I think to some degree, not surprisingly, although I think we would say we were hoping for a greater uptake at this point, but taxi data is underrepresented in what's being collected. Province-wide, 28% of taxi companies are submitting their data. And the highest level of submission is in Metro Vancouver, where 50% of the taxi licensees are reporting on a regular basis. Also, companies with the largest vehicle fleets are submitting their data as well. So what we have seen and some of the challenges is that many of the small companies use manual dispatch and manual reporting. And so it's been a challenge for them to be able to digitize and provide digital information to the ministry. And they don't have technologies or systems to help track and really report detailed trip data that we think is important to be able to make decisions and shape policies and enforcement and compliance. We did anticipate some uptake and some time for that to mature. And I think because of COVID and other factors, that's continuing to take place. We're optimistic that we'll continue to get better, and it is getting better, and we're working very closely with the taxi industry on this. And then on the TNS side of things, you'll see from the chart on slide 16 that all of the TNS companies that are operating in BC are actively providing data, submitting their data. Moving on to slide 17, looking at industry profiles. So for the TNS companies, we see that TNS licensees are operating in each of the 5 regions that the board has established for TNS operations, and that was on the map that I previously showed. With taxi companies, there are 188 licensed companies, and it's really the operational area for the taxis is determined by the terms of the license that gets granted to them and what they apply for. The driver and vehicle data is really a snapshot in time, and so the data that we're providing here is from July 2023, and it shows that a total number of drivers and vehicles operating under all taxi and TNS licensees this year in July, or as of July. Moving on to slide 18, an overview of all the trip data. Again, acknowledging that there is incomplete data, and so this is the kind of the current state of the data that we have. But you'll see that the completed trips in BC for taxi and TNS this has been being collected since late 2019. You'll see obviously on the chart there's a significant drop due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and you can really see the impact, even if the data is incomplete, it's still telling. And so there was a significant drop, and you'll also see that we've continued to sort of climb. The industry has really tried to climb, and it's really quite now significantly higher than before COVID-19. So taxis are still sort of above where they were from the data point of view. In late 2019, they were higher, and then have recovered, but are still in the process of increasing. And then, of course, TNSs have, as the program has come on board and as they become legalized, have increased over time. I'll also note that the reporting from the taxis has fluctuated over time due to the challenges that I mentioned before and challenges in dealing with the COVID pandemic. And so there has been a gradual recovery, and with that, and as taxi companies in particular have recovered, they've turned their focus back to the data and working with us to provide the data. From a market share perspective, and based on this data, you'll see as of July 2023 that taxis represent about 30% of reported trips. Again, we think that's an underrepresentation, but that's what the data is showing. And the TNS sector shows about 70% of the market share for reported trips. Moving on to slide 19 with focus on enforcement. So what we're showing on slide 19 from a compliance enforcement perspective is the number of violation tickets issued by MODI enforcement officers. And I'll note that both local law enforcement and municipal bylaw officers can also issue tickets to taxi and TNS operators. That data is not shown here. So any additional data from other jurisdictions, particularly local jurisdictions, is not represented in this data. So CVSE, or the Commercial Vehicle Safety and Enforcement branch, collaborates with the police to target companies that are operating TNSs illegally. And there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes around data and tracking and trends and reports that come in on how we can try to track down and enforce against companies operating without a license. And so the combined enforcement operations between our ministry and CVSE and police has increased, and our working relationship with the police has only gotten stronger over time. And I'll also note that COVID did impact the number of violation tickets issued in 2020. Enforcement was not as present during that time, just due to the nature of the pandemic and the number of staff and actually the decrease in licensees who were operating at the time. Moving on to slide 20 for accessible taxis. So you'll see that this presents the information related to BC trips taken in a wheelchair accessible vehicle. So this is taxi data. Again, we think it's somewhat underrepresented or underreported, but you'll see that, again, there was a drop in 2019. And while it's gone up and down, it's been a fairly consistent line of wheelchair accessible vehicle trips taken over the past several quarters. We will see, I hope, and as our program comes on board, an increase in the actual volume and availability of these wheelchair accessible vehicle trips as our program takes off, which we'll turn to now on slide 21. So we launched the Passenger Transportation Accessibility Program in January of this year. The uptake was really significant with industry. It was very well received. The goal of the PTAP program, or PTAP, is to really promote equity and accessibility in the passenger directed vehicle industry. So this is really phase one. And phase one provides grants to taxi companies to increase the availability of the wheelchair accessible vehicles, or the WAVs. So this year, for the first phase in the first program, we provided $2.6 million in grants for vehicle maintenance to 51 taxi companies. Again, very strong uptake. The applications, all applicants received funding, and we maximized the amount of money that we had put in the allocation for this first phase. So it was very successful for this first phase. We are planning additional phases, and so it will be kind of dependent on our ongoing conversations with industry and what the needs are, constant conversations with the accessibility community on where the needs and the gaps are. But some of the ideas that we have for future programs include reducing the cost of operating, purchasing, and converting the wheelchair accessible taxis, which is where we hope to see an increase by incentivizing more taxi drivers to actually operate, to purchase and operate and convert their taxis, and then also providing additional training for drivers to help increase comfort levels and competency around the special requirements needed to operate a wheelchair accessible vehicle. And again, the fee that is being charged to the TNS licensees of 90 cents per trip is what is helping to contribute to and support these programs that also launched in January of this year. So it's all fairly new, but so far quite successful, and we hope to only increase and grow these accessibility programs. So I'll just wrap up. Thank you for your time and your patience as we've gone through a lot of the content and the detail here. I look forward to your detailed questions. Again, our BC framework, when it launched in 2019, was really focused on safety, compliance, and enforcement and equity, balancing the modernization of the taxi industry, as well as welcoming TNS licensees into BC legally in a balanced, equitable framework. The framework continues to evolve. We're hopefully well out of the pandemic and trying to get to a state of normalcy in the market, but there's a lot that we'll continue to do, whether it's evolving the data, improving the kind of the information that we're collecting and reporting, strengthening enforcement, including, more broadly across the province, looking at additional policies between ourselves and the Passenger Transportation Board that can strengthen and improve the framework. And then also, as I mentioned, expanding as much as we can the accessible vehicle programs and accessible programming and services altogether. So we'll continue to work with industry, the accessibility community, obviously the Passenger Transportation Board, local governments, and others as we evolve the framework. And we also look forward to the report and the work that this special standing committee is doing to help shape and inform how we continue to evolve the program. And we really look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'll open it up to committee members for questions or comments in terms of what we've seen. Shirley, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and appreciate the presentation today. I do have a number of questions, Chair, so I'm happy to, if I see other hands, I will cede the floor. But so thanks a lot. I obviously have a lot to learn about this file, so I'm looking forward to the discussions that we have, but I have some very specific questions. So when we look at slide 12, when we talk about protecting accessibility, maybe I just want to walk through how I understand the per trip fee. So in January of this year, 90 cents was the rate that every time a trip was taken would be forwarded to the particular fund, which is titled accessibility, to enhance accessibility. Is that correct? So in essence, companies probably pass that on to the consumer. They add it to the trip price, or do they explain to me where the 90 cents comes from?
Correct. So, well, yes and no. So I'll just walk through it a little bit. So
Sure.
There was previously a 30-cent fee for the TNS company. So for the TNS company licensees and not the taxis. And so that has been in place since the program launched. And then in January, it increased from 30 cents to 90 cents. And so that is a per trip fee that the TNS drivers charge the passengers. And then it does come into government, and then it covers the costs of a number of things, not just the accessibility program, which are on the slide. So the database, the technology, the staff, the Passenger Transportation Board, it covers basically the elements of running the program. And then it also contributes to the accessibility program. And then so we in government collect the fees and then program them, if you will, or allocate them, whether it's to the program staff, the technology, or the accessibility program. So the purpose of the fee is to cover all of the program costs for running the new TNS program.
Thank you for that. So it is passed on to the passenger, though, the 90 cents. It is then returned to government. You collect that money back. I guess I just, in the spirit of transparency, so the money comes to government, and the fund is related to increasing accessibility, but it also actually funds a lot of administrative costs and technology improvements.
Yes.
Is there do you publish, or is it transparent in terms of the total? I see that the grants you mentioned, 2.6 million had gone out in terms of the wheelchair accessible vehicle maintenance rebate. Is there transparency about the total amount collected and the breakdown between what is spent on improving accessibility and on actually providing government support or ministry support to run the program? Is there a breakdown, and is that provided publicly?
So what has been, I can actually tell you what's been collected for each of the fiscal years. And I will say before I get to that, this is a model that other jurisdictions are using consistently. So for example, we looked across Canada, we looked across North America and the United States, we looked at other jurisdictions, and globally, this fee is a consistent model. So it's not that we're doing something differently for ride hailing that is unique or made in BC only. And so, for example, when we increased the fees, we did a pretty detailed economic analysis of what is the threshold at which we could charge that would make sense and that we could collect and is consistent with other jurisdictions. So, for example, Quebec also charges 90 cents. So we did do that work, and it is consistent with how industry is operating, ride-hailing industry is operating across other comparable jurisdictions. So in fiscal year 2021, we collected 2.6 million. In fiscal 21-22, it was 4.4 million. And in 22-23, it was 9.4 million. And so, and then that comes in, as I mentioned, but it is transparent in the sense of how the bill was put forward, what the fee covers. All of that has been published and transparent from the beginning of the program of what is applicable to that revenue source. And then in return, that is actually just a fee that covers the program, and we haven't increased necessarily the base budget or the stubs as a result. It's basically paid for by the fees.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate the clarity and the numbers that are provided. Do you have, and if you don't have it today, you can let me know what the breakdown is between providing funding to increasing accessibility out of that, of the millions that have been collected. What percentage of that has gone to increasing accessibility, and what percentage of that, and I appreciate knowing that it's being done elsewhere, but I think it's important to recognize when a program is called, related to increasing accessibility, it would be good to know what portion of that funding is actually doing that job, and that it's a much bigger bucket than just accessibility. So I'll leave that question with you. If you have it, that's fine. Chair, I'd like to move on to one other topic, if it's all right. Well, actually two. In your report, in your presentation, and also in the documents, there is a repeated comment about data being underreported. And in fact, it's quite dramatically underreported in some parts of the province. When you look at the information, we are moving to a data-driven decision-making process, and yet we have data in other parts of BC that's coming in at a rate of 18%. So I would question how we, for example, look at decisions around rural BC and rural parts of the province, which I assume is the other part. Looking at the map, the blue part of the province is a really big geographic area in the province. So is the collection of data optional? Is it may or must report?
Thanks. I'll respond initially, and then I'll ask Steve Haywood, our registrar, to comment further, if that's okay. So back to your question about the portion of funding to accessibility. The accessibility program just launched this year, and so part of the fund in the fees was really to do the program, launch the program and build the program itself. So that's what we have been directing the fees to for the past few years. So the accessibility program itself is 2.6 million. I think that's on the slide. That was the first PTAP program. Phase 1 is 2.6 million of the fees that were collected. So the remaining fees have gone between the Passenger Transportation Board and the ministry. And if you'd like more of a breakdown, we're happy to get that. I don't have those details, but the remainder has gone to launching the program over the past few years, and it's split between the ministry costs and the PTB costs. And then for the data, as I mentioned, this is one, it's definitely a work in progress. It's something that in particular we know, and we work very closely with the taxi industry, including all of the rural taxi operators, especially the small ones. They have a very challenging time with getting the systems. And so part of what we looked at is, are there opportunities? And again, this isn't something that we've established or been able to commit to, but are there things that we can do to help increase capacity of the taxi industry, especially the smaller ones, to be able to implement systems to provide data, or to help them and modernize their processes to really be able to provide the data in a way that is less cumbersome to them and becomes a new, more modern way of operating for those organizations, which has really been the focus of the modernizing piece on the taxi side of things. So it's a work in progress. COVID definitely had a significant impact on that, but we're continuing to work with the taxi companies on that. I think we've also, there is a requirement for some data and not all. So we've had some required fields and then more broad fields that we're trying to collect. We've also created some real flexibility on their ability to report, just given some of the challenges they faced. And so we've tried to be both firm in our expectation around what companies are providing consistently and credibly, but also realistic in understanding what they're able to do and what they're not able to do, and not putting extra burden on them that they're simply not able to deliver on. I might ask Steve Haywood, who's our registrar, to provide more specifics around what's required in the must versus the may, if that's okay, Chair.
Thank you. Yeah, and Kate put it very eloquently. You know, when we started back in 2019 with the requirement for data, and TNS companies really started operating in that December 2019, January 2020. With COVID hitting shortly after, it had a profound effect on the passenger-directed vehicle industry. And enforcement on those data requirements, as the registrar, the decision was made to not enforce immediately until the industry had recovered. And with the recovery now, you know, in a good spot, we have worked with the board on updating the terms and conditions of license for all of the taxi companies around the province that has the requirement now for data. And we're beginning enforcement action over this August and September, starting with Region 1, so starting with the main region of the Metro Vancouver area, and then working into other regions from there. One thing to note, and it wasn't in the slide deck, but with the 50% of the taxi companies of submitting data, that's actually 80% of the taxis in the province. Obviously, the urban areas have the greatest concentration, but there is obviously that need for in the smaller areas as well for us to maintain that. So we're expecting that we will see, now that enforcement's begun in earnest, we're expecting to see an increase, over the rest of this year on the data that is being collected, as well as the quality of that data.
Thank you very much for those answers. My last question, Chair, is related to the regulatory system itself. And I'm wondering if the ministry is aware, I'm certain they must be, but the Passenger Transportation Board in their, provision of information to us have suggested that the split regulatory system is perhaps not as effective as it could or should be, and in fact are talking about the potential of looking at combining the licensure and governance and monitoring of SAs and GAs and giving it all to the Passenger Transportation Board. So I'm wondering if the ministry is aware of that, has had conversations about that, or has an opinion about that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for the question. We work very closely with the PT board. I have monthly meetings with the chair and have very positive working relationships with them. And so much of the content that they submitted to you, we're not surprised by. And we've had many conversations. So for example, the conversation around the budget, which is also in their submission, we've been talking about since I've been the deputy of transportation and infrastructure, and we're very pleased that we were able to get an increase from Treasury Board for the PT board over the past year. And so we've done a lot of work together on trying to get the board what they are looking for to be able to do what they believe they need to do in their regulatory capacity. I will say though that the concept of the split regulatory system, and any sort of combining of authorities is not something we've talked about. So that is something that we need to explore. Having said that, the structure of the PT, the Passenger Transportation Board and the ministry has been in place for years, well before any of the TNS and the ride-hailing structure came into place. So that's a much bigger question, I'd suggest, and not something that we have contemplated as part of the ride-hailing implementation. There's a much bigger industry beyond taxis and ride-hailing that PTB and the ministry regulate. And so between the commercial vehicles and buses and limousines and others, that's a much more systemic question for government to contemplate, and not something that we have currently discussed with the chair or the board, at least from my perspective.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions from other committee members? All right. Oh, Kelly, go ahead.
Thank you. At the end of the presentation, slide 21, I was just wondering if you could give a little bit more description on where the companies that are getting the accessible vehicles are located, what the distribution is of those improvements.
We don't have that distribution with us today, but we will be happy to submit that to you and get the detailed data. The information that we have in front of us right now is just province-wide. But as I mentioned before, all of the applicants that sought program support and grants received it and received the amount that they requested. And this was really, this was also to seek for those taxis that already were accessible to help cover their costs. So this was to cover, to help those companies defray the costs as part of this first program. So they were the existing taxis across the province.
Thanks. We've got Janet and then Jordan. Janet, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. My question goes back to an earlier part of your presentation and the role of the Passenger Transportation Board. And you had mentioned that they have the authority to set rates. And you, as an example, you gave, I think, what was like a minimum rate. And I'm wondering, do they have the authority to set maximum rates?
The short answer is yes, they do.
Thank you.
Jordan, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I noticed that the accessible vehicle trips tended to be flat over the last couple of years. Did that include HandyDart, or is it exclusive? Is HandyDart exclusive from those vehicle trips?
No, it does not include HandyDart. That's a separate.
Okay. In terms of the access to funding for the wheelchair accessible vehicles, is it accessible only to the taxi industry, or do the TNS companies have access to that fund as well?
So currently, it's only to taxis. Taxis are the segment of the PDVs, or the passenger directed vehicles, that have a requirement to provide wheelchair accessible vehicles. So it's really to defray that obligation and to try to create both incentives, but also an equal playing field, and not disincentivize wheelchair accessible vehicles. And so this first phase of the program was for those existing wheelchair accessible vehicles to help defray the cost. As I mentioned, what we're intending to do, and as the program grows over the next year or two, is expand the scope of the program, and we'll consider looking at opportunities to create incentives for the TNSs to also provide wheelchair accessible vehicles. So this is just the first phase for the existing taxis.
And it was interesting to, okay, is there a 10-year limitation on taxis as well in terms of the age of the fleet, the age of the vehicles? Can they be max out at 10 years?
No.
But TNS vehicles do max out at 10 years.
Yes.
So how does the $30,000 a year in terms of maintenance costs attributed to these wheelchair accessible vehicles, how does that break out? How does that 30,000 come about? And what does it offset? It seems hard to imagine that it's an extra $30,000 a year to maintain those vehicles. And you think about it over the course of 10 years, that's the $300,000 in cost. And especially if these vehicles can even last longer. So how does that break out, and what is that used for?
Yeah, I'm not sure we have all of the details of what the breakout is, and it's an estimate based on our work with the industry, but I'd be happy to have our registrar, Steve Haywood, provide more details on your question.
And just last question, why do you think that and it's a speculation obviously, but why would those wheelchair accessible vehicle trips be essentially flat over the last couple of years?
Yeah, and I'll also ask Steve to weigh in on that as well, but I believe it's because they haven't necessarily, with COVID for one, but also because of the cost, there's not necessarily an incentive to add more. So they meet their obligations and the requirements, but they haven't necessarily increased. And so what we're trying to do is increase the volume of the number of vehicles that are available.
So you think that it's a supply side for the vehicles, that it's a limitation on
That's
number
my
of
hunch
trips?
without having the data to back that up.
Fair enough. Thank you.
All right, okay, we've come to the end of our time. It looks like we've canvassed the questions. I want to thank Kay, Steve, and Jeremy for your presentation, answering our questions, really helping us to lay the foundation in terms of our work going forward. Appreciate that and the documents. And so I'd like to thank you for that. Committee members, we're going to take 2 minutes and to allow our new to bring in our presenters from the Passenger Transportation Board. So we'll just take a couple minutes to for that before we get into our next presentation. So got a couple minutes off camera. Thank you very much. welcome. We have our next presenters from the Passenger Transportation Board. Like to recognize and welcome our chair, the chair Carmela Alivato, the vice chair Baljinder Kaur Narang, the executive director Heather Stewart. Welcome. Thank you very much. We're looking forward to your presentation. We've got the documents. We're not going to be doing screen sharing, so you can refer to the documents if you wish. And I know there's a lot of ground to cover, a lot to talk about, so and a lot of interest from our committee members. If we do need more time, we can reschedule that as needed. So appreciate our opportunity to talk with you today, and I'll hand it over to you for the presentation. Thank you. Carmela, is that over to you in terms of to start us off? You're on mute.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I'm getting a loop here, so can you hear me? You can hear me?
We hear you fine. You're coming through. You're coming across fine.
Okay, thank you. I just want to start by acknowledging that I'm still on mute. No. I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. What we're going to do today is I'm going to be just introducing Heather, who is our executive director, and she will be going through our presentation. And after that, we'll deal with questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're all ready to go. I'll proceed with our PowerPoint. We have, like you said, have a lot of ground to cover. So thank you for the opportunity to present this information today. The accompanying report from the board, along with other materials, was provided to the committee members to review in advance. This presentation highlights the main points contained in the board's report. I understand that the committee members will be following along with any presentation materials, and therefore I will not be sharing my screen. So talking about the agenda, this presentation will follow the same format as the board's report. First, we will give a brief overview of the board and its mandate. We understand that the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure has been invited to provide a legislative and regulatory overview of the Passenger Transportation Act, so we will not focus on that aspect. Next, we will discuss each of the main topics that comprise the special committee's term of reference as listed on the agenda slide, and conclude with the board's recommendations to the committee. First, an overview of the board, starting at slide 3. The board is an independent tribunal established under the Passenger Transportation Act. The board oversees and regulates the passenger transportation industry and makes decisions on applications for special authorizations. Special authorizations include passenger-directed vehicles such as taxis or limousines, intercity buses, and transportation network services, also called TNS or ride-hailing. The board determines applications after considering Section 28 criteria, including whether the applicant is fit, proper, and capable of providing the service, there is a public need for the service, and the application promotes sound economic conditions in the passenger transportation business. The board was established in 2004, and its original mandate was focused on making application decisions. The Act was amended in 2019, along with recommendations from the Standing Committee. This expanded the board's mandate. This is because of several factors. The board was now responsible for regulating TNS. There was clarification of the board's jurisdiction, and the board was expected to use data to make objective, evidence-based decisions. In response to this expanded mandate, the board proposed core staffing and resource requirements to government in November 2020, and the board received its budget letter in October 2022. The board's scope was broadened since 2019. It now has an ongoing role to gather information and monitor the status of the passenger transportation industry. The board still makes application decisions, but now must engage in systems level analysis rather than merely assessing the merits of the discrete application. Now, when considering the public need test, the board needs to understand systems level demand in the region. When considering the sound economics conditions test, the board needs to understand systems level supply and sustainability across various sectors operating in the region. The board is mandated to conduct reviews and make decisions about the industry more broadly. There are numerous sector-wide matters that the board may determine, including fleet sizes, operating areas, and rates. The board refers to these as systemic decisions. The Standing Committee recommended that the board collect, analyze, and provide data to support evidence-based decision-making. Data and evidence are not the same thing. The TRIP database, also known as the data warehouse, at Modi contains TRIP data of approximately 90 million trips. Raw trip data cannot be entered into evidence unless systems-level analysis occurs. Economics expertise is required to analyze the data and develop an expert foundation to contextualize the evidence. This turns the data into evidence, which must be introduced into the board's decision-making process in an administratively fair manner. The board requires internal economics and data analytics capacity to create dynamic economic modeling in support of decision-making. The board does not delegate this role to Modi, and it cannot use contracted external expertise to scale for a variety of reasons. By modeling public need and sound economic conditions factors in-house, the board is better positioned to ensure a sustainable industry. Since receiving its expanded mandate, the board has undertaken a fundamental review of its purpose, values, and goals. The board recently published a 3-year strategic plan where the board has identified and explained several key values that underpin its decision-making and strategic direction. These key values include service to the public, which relates to the public need criteria, regulating the industry, which relates to the sound economic conditions criteria, and how the board will undertake its work as an independent tribunal. The board has further defined public need and sound economic factors in policy. These factors form the foundation of economic analysis for evidence-based decision-making on application and for system-level regulation of the industry. So the next section summarizes the board's report regarding vehicle supply and accessible vehicles, starting at slide 9. First, discussing conventional vehicle supply. In 2018, Dr. Hera recommended a one-time opportunity for taxi licensees to expand their fleets by up to 15%. The board adopted this recommendation as part of taxi modernization, approving an additional 332 conventional vehicles. The board adopted, due to the pandemic, and at the request of the taxi sector, the board has extended the taxi modernization deadline to December 2023. As of May 2023, 280 conventional vehicles, or 84% of the allotment under taxi modernization, have been activated. Demand for passenger transportation decreased during the pandemic. As a result, taxis voluntarily reduced their taxi fleets to meet the lower demand, and some TNS delayed commencing operations. The board commissioned a study by Dr. Hera in 2021 into the economic effects of COVID-19 on the industry, as well as a follow-up report in 2023. These reports are referenced in the board materials package to the committee. Overall, there has been an adequate supply of conventional vehicles since 2019, due primarily to the reduction in demand caused by the pandemic. Now discussing accessible vehicle supply. As part of taxi modernization, the board also approved an increase in 102 wheelchair accessible vehicles, or WAV, Again, there was slow uptake due to the pandemic and supply chain issues. The board has extended the taxi modernization deadline, including WAVs, to December 2023. As of May 2023, 42% of the WAV allotment under taxi modernization have been activated. The availability and viability of WAV will be directly impacted by the Passenger Transportation Accessibility Program, or PTAP. The PTAP program is a subsidization program run by the Ministry of Transportation pursuant to the regulation. The board recognizes that there may not be an adequate supply of wheelchair accessible vehicles. The board will assess the true state of accessible vehicles after taxi modernization is complete, and the board has assessed the impact of the PTAP program on accessible vehicle supply. The TNS business model envisions a flexible supply of drivers and vehicles. The board sets maximum fleet sizes for taxis, and there is a difference between a maximum fleet size and actual fleet utilization. For the board to accurately measure supply, it requires complete and reliable data in the TRIP database. Due to resource and data issues since 2019, the board has been monitoring vehicle supply through hiring an external expert, Dr. Hera. The board's economics team was hired as of March 2023. Now the board has internal resources to analyze and model data as it pertains to fleets and other topics. The board has the authority to change fleet sizes on a case-by-case basis and make systemic decisions on fleet size and composition. Reviewing the vehicle supply will become a more pressing concern as the province emerges from the pandemic and taxis and TNS find their new competitive equilibrium. Next, a discussion about passenger and driver safety, starting at slide 15. There are two ways the board promotes safety: by applying its fit, proper, and capable criteria to applicants and licensees, and with a variety of safety programs. The registrar at the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure also has a variety of safety-related responsibilities. Dealing first with the fit, proper, and capable criteria, the board conducts fitness assessments on all applicants. In 2021, the board requested that this be made a threshold test to place fitness at the forefront. This occurred in November 2022, following the passing of Bill 40. Licensee fitness and capability is an ongoing requirement. The board may undertake fitness reviews under the Act at any time. There are some improvements detailed in the board's report that could assist the board with fitness assessments. The board is in the process of reviewing and updating board policy related to fit, proper, and capable. The board also has a variety of programs meant to promote safety. As detailed in the board report, the board imposes terms and conditions on all TNS licensees regarding apps, which emphasize the need to keep personal information private while providing passengers with vital information about the driver and vehicle that will pick them up. In 2004, the board began a taxi camera program to promote driver and passenger safety. There have been a lot of changes over the years to the industry, technology, and privacy requirements. So the board is reviewing and updating this program. The board also established and supports taxi Bill of Rights programs. The goal of these programs are to promote consistent, high-quality service and clarify expectations. Now discussing the Section 28 test, starting at slide 18. Currently, the Section 28 test of fit, proper, and capable, public need, and sound economic conditions work well, and the board recommends maintaining them. There are many holdovers from the previous legislation in the current Act. This may account for the focus under Section 28 on the economics of the passenger transportation industry. This approach, while important, may not support the board to examine broader systemic and societal impacts. Therefore, the board recommends adding another criterion such as sustainability. The sustainability criterion can refer to external factors that impact or are impacted by the industry, such as environmental sustainability or labor sustainability. The board would like to apply all the Section 28 criteria to all applications before the board, including transfers. And it is also important to apply the same criteria to application and systemic decisions to solidify their connection. The board would also like to see the current licensing system under the Act modernized and streamlined. This includes streamlining the approach to mass updating licenses and changing the current authorization system into a licensing system based on sector type. The board could then issue a license, like a taxi license, and have a standard term and conditions guide applicable to that sector. In moving to a sector-based licensing scheme, it would also be beneficial to clarify definitions of the various sector types, like the definitions of TNS, and examine how to handle hybrid models. The predecessor Motor Carriers Commission had jurisdiction over the whole commercial passenger transportation industry. In 2004, when the Act came into force, the legislature split the regulatory model between general authorizations, or GAs, and special authorizations, or SAs. The effect was to create two regulatory schemes for commercial passenger transportation with different rules. The board only has jurisdiction over SAs. The registrar has jurisdiction over GAs. In making SA decisions, the board must consider the application in terms of public need and sound economic conditions. But the board is not aware of the details of general authorizations operating in the region. The split scheme impacts the board's ability to assess public need and sound economic conditions and causes confusion in the industry. However, it's more concerning when the board is attempting to undertake systems-level analysis. The board uses its expertise to evaluate changing demand, monitor supply, check destructive monopoly power, and independently regulate the industry in the public interest. It is difficult to economically regulate the industry without jurisdiction over or data regarding more than half of the commercial passenger transportation market. The board would like to explore whether similar risks are applicable to all commercial passenger transportation. If the risks are similar, then the applicable industry should be subject to the same Section 28 tests and independent regulation and oversight by the board. This consolidation would reduce fragmentation and confusion. The next section is regarding employment in the passenger transportation industry, starting at slide 22. The board's mandate is not focused on labor market or employment matters. The board licenses the passenger transportation industry, and licensees hire the drivers. Its impact on employment in the industry is generally indirect, but the board takes labor market forces into account when regulating the industry. The way the board regulates the industry may affect employment within the industry, for example, through supply or price. There have been concerns expressed about TNS potentially lowering driver earnings once a large market share is achieved. The Standing Committee recommended the board collect driver earnings. The board has been collecting driver earnings since 2020 on a quarterly basis. These driver earning data is averaged across the company and not at the driver level. The board has been regularly reviewing TNS driver earnings data, and there has not been a significant change in average earnings since 2020. Currently, the board approaches questions of employment through its sound economic conditions criterion, which is less direct. As discussed earlier, the board recommends adding sustainability criterion to the Section 28 tests so the board can model employment as a long-term contributor to sustainability of the industry. Competition provides options for employment. If there are a variety of TNS and taxi options in a region, then it would be difficult for one company to dominate the market and underpay its drivers. Competition can mitigate negative monopolistic behavior and create options for employment in the industry. According to the 2023 Dr. Harris report, There is a significant driver shortage impacting taxis and TNS. In April 2022, the board prioritized undertaking systemic decisions on rates. This was done in anticipation of market restructuring from the introduction of TNS and other issues as the industry emerged from the pandemic. Industry consultations on the rates project is ongoing. There are more details on this in the board report. The board's ongoing work to make systemic decisions on rates for taxis and TNS sectors is an example of how the board is supporting the industry during market restructuring and labor shortages. The next section is about environmental impacts, starting at slide number 26. The board has taken active steps to support public transportation through price floor regulation of both taxi and TNS sectors. The past standing committee recommended the board set a minimum per trip price that is not less than the cost of public transit. The board set a TNS minimum rates rule, considering both the cost of public transit and the minimum taxi flag rate. Further consideration of the price floor is occurring as part of the board's systemic decision on rates project. The board is concerned about the impact of passenger transportation on congestion. In 2023, the board contracted with Acquera Consulting, Clark Lim, to undertake a congestion study in the Lower Mainland. The board wishes to take an active role in protecting the environment in light of the climate change emergency. As a result, the board has prioritized the climate change project to fully review its regulation of the passenger transportation industry in this regard. The current Section 28 test allows the board to approach climate change indirectly through the sound economic conditions criterion, and as discussed in other sections, the board recommends adding a sustainability criterion to the Section 28 test so that the board can examine the matter more directly and regulate the passenger transportation industry in terms of environmental sustainability. The next section discusses services to small, rural, and remote communities, starting at slide 29. Communities fall across a spectrum of urban to rural. The board refers to small, rural, or remote communities as having low-density populations. Low-density or rural areas tend to be undersupplied and may not have access to public transportation, leaving residents with limited transportation options. Key characteristics that create challenges to the viability of a commercial passenger transportation service in low-density areas include greater distances between destinations, lower ridership, wide disparities in service wait times, and increased deadheading where a vehicle is unable to secure a paid return trip. Lack of competition in low-density areas can result in lower service quality and lack of choice. However, direct competition can result in non-viable businesses, leading to instability and future service gaps for the community. There are challenges to both TNS and taxis in low-density areas that are described in detail in the board's report. The board must apply the public need and sound economic conditions tests, but would be less likely to find these exist in low-density areas due to lack of commercial viability. While this may indicate an issue with the Section 28 test, it is more likely demonstrating that the board is meant to regulate commercially viable passenger-directed transportation. The board has limited options to encourage low-density service under the current system. The board does not provide passenger transportation services, it licenses them. So there has to be someone willing to serve the market. The business must be commercially viable if it is to provide sustained service to the community, and the board does not have authority to subsidize any service or establish a transit system. In addition to fragmentation of the general authorizations and special authorizations under the current scheme, which was discussed earlier, there is a larger context about the division between public transportation and commercial passenger transportation. The board does not have jurisdiction over transit, but it affects the ability of the board to regulate commercial passenger transportation. The direct impact This directly impacts the ability for low-density communities to receive transportation services. There are bus examples in the board's report. Some examples are general authorizations, other special authorizations, and other transit, but they appear to be performing the same service. The purpose of this is to illustrate the complexity of various regimes that have developed in BC over time. These schemes have been around for a long time. Government is currently examining these topics, but the board wanted to raise it in response to this committee's inquiry into transportation services to small, rural, and remote communities. Under the current scheme, the board can set higher rates to try to offset the challenges of providing essential services to low-density communities, or try to protect the one passenger transportation business in the low-density area to consolidate profits. However, it cannot create a subsidized public transit option. It is unlikely that the board can meet the transportation needs of all low-density communities using commercial private operators and the Act. The board encourages a reassessment of the current system and the policy goals behind public transportation and passenger transportation, particularly as it pertains to low-density areas. Nevertheless, the board is willing to do what it can to enable passenger transportation services to low-density areas and has prioritized projects in that regard. The board's recommendations are at the end of the report submitted to this committee, so I will not elaborate on the details further. In general, the board is seeking substantial amendments to the legislation, along with resources and data to support the board meeting its mandate. The board appreciates the opportunity to provide this submission to the special committee. If you require any further clarification, information, or further submissions, the board is happy to provide this information to the committee throughout the process. So this concludes our presentation, and we're happy to take the committee's questions. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Heather, for the presentation. I know we've got interest, lots to discuss. Anyone want to start us off here in terms of questions? Janet, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. There's a lot of information there, and it may take me a bit to kind of get my head around it. One area that I'm particularly interested in pursuing is the issue of the role of competition with regard to the what are we calling it? The TNS sector. And if I understand correctly, that the premise is that the more companies that are operating in that area, then the more that would help with the keeping the income of the drivers higher. And I'm wondering, I mean, I get supply and demand, but I'm just wondering if you can say a bit more about that because of the implication of it being an app-based industry. So there's nothing right now, there's nothing stopping drivers or disincentivizing drivers, I should say, from signing on to as many app companies as there are out there. And what we know from the consultation that's been done, the pieces in the news, that what happens, how drivers are keeping their income at a livable or almost livable rate is by signing on to many apps. And they're working, what we hear is they're working 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week in order to make barely minimum wage. So I'm wondering if you can say a bit more about where you see competition playing a role there.
I think I'll start and then hand it over to Heather to elaborate a bit further. So in terms of where competition comes in, when we assess an application, we look at the impact of granting that application on all of the other operators. The board has a policy or has decided that TNSs and taxis are separate. So although we do look at the impact of one on the other. It isn't the case that we approach it from the perspective that the more TNS companies you have, the better it is. We apply the same test. If in our view, approving a TNS application would unduly harm other operators, we don't, that's something that is a factor in our consideration. In terms of drivers being able to sign on to however many app-based companies, TNS companies, we don't control that. That generally what we'll get is we can ask a company whether, what their rules are with respect to drivers signing onto other companies, but their approach is that they want to make it as accessible as possible to drivers so that they can recruit as many and have as many drivers available as the demand is out there. So it is something that's a gap. We don't control that, but sometimes we ask about it, and sometimes applicants will tell us what their policy is. Heather, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just speaking more to the sort of the larger market forces with regard to competition, and the board's unique role. So there aren't other jurisdictions where there is a board that is regulating both taxis and TNS at sort of the provincial or state level, and so it gives the board an opportunity to be able to monitor and try to balance the different sectors. Some of the concerns that have been expressed in other standing committees is related to monopolistic powers, basically. So when you have a company that comes in that overwhelms everybody else in the industry and creates a monopoly, and it doesn't matter what kind of service that is, then if that goes unchecked, then it can have impacts on driver earnings, because it's essentially the only game in town. So what happens with competition in areas that can sustain it? So in low density areas, they might not be able to sustain that. But if we're talking about more urban centers, if you have a variety of options for the consumers, that's great, but it's also great for the drivers, because if there is a particular sector or company that is not paying their drivers, then they can shop around and they have options to go elsewhere. And it's that competition creates a more stable environment for driver earnings, because they're now competing essentially with each other for drivers, and that's very much the case right now with the driver shortage.
All right, okay, thank you. Further questions? Jordan, go ahead.
Thank you. In terms of in terms of an application to the PTB, could you give us some sort of sense of how long that process is for that application to be considered and a decision made?
So it can vary depending on the type of application, the amount of information that's provided. So for example, an application might have a date of, say, March 1st, 2023. It's first processed or reviewed by the registrar, the passenger transportation branch, and they may go back to the applicant and get additional information. They reach a particular point, and I'm not quite sure at what point that is, but then they send it to the board. When it comes to us, it's not necessarily necessarily complete. So, there will be what we have our board investigations. And then there is a time within which the panel member will, address and come and make a decision. The board was for a time quite understaffed, even in terms of vice chairs. So we now have a number of 7. We have 7 part-time. We're all part-time vice chairs. So our aim is to try and get decisions out within 3 months. We don't always do it. In some cases, particularly in some of the bigger TNS cases where we get, thousands of pages of information, and we have to get reports on it, that's slower. But our aim is to do within 3 months. We're getting better, but we're not there. Definitely not there.
Okay, thank you. Has the emergence of autonomous vehicles, or the future of autonomous vehicles, been considered in this regulatory framework?
It's very interesting you raised that. I know a couple of years ago, one of the car makers actually was talking about having a fleet of, this was an informal discussion with the former chair, having a fleet of autonomous vehicles. So it's there in the background, but it's not something that we have addressed. But I definitely agree with you that it is something that at some point will come before the board. And then the question will be, fit and proper, right? That the fitness test will be very significant, as well as the others, of course.
And just the last question, in terms of the GA versus the SA differentiation, and I think I heard Ms. Stewart say that there's a desire to see the PTB's ability to approve GA applications and take it away from the registrar. Is that what I heard? And could you maybe expand a little bit on why that would be necessary and how it impacts some of those more GA type of applications?
I'll just give a very brief comment and then I'll hand it over to Heather. So it's something that struck me about a year ago when I was dealing with a particular application, and particularly it seems to me in limousine and wine tours, or not taxis per se, but that kind of service. And it was actually a shuttle to do wine tours, and that's where it struck me that there are a lot of GAs who do that. And so when I was assessing this application, I had to consider what is whether the sound economic conditions and the public need. And there was what I was advised, and as I later looked into it, there's a bit of a wall between the two. We don't have access to that immediate information. We also, when the GAs are approved, the only consideration is fit and proper, whether they are a fit operator. There's no assessment of what the impact will be on the rest of the industry, on other operators, whether there's a public need for it, and what the impact will be. So I raised that both with the minister and the deputy minister at the time, just in passing, saying, this has come to my attention, and I think we need to look at this. But we ourselves haven't done a lot of work in terms of work with the ministry. But it's something that has come up with other applications as well. And so I'll turn it over to Heather to answer it more fully. But just so you know where that comes from, it comes from actually a decision, having to make a decision and consider the public need and the economic condition.
Yeah, it comes up frequently, actually, with particularly related things, like buses or wine tours or things like that. So basically, we're just talking about a reversion to what the Motor Carriers Commission had before this act was brought in. They had the purview over all of the commercial passenger transportation industry. And I'm appreciating that there also may need to be some assessment of what is a GA and what is an SA in terms of risk, and whether it should or should not be in that bucket for under the commercial passenger transportation arena. So if they're, the idea being that if they are the same risk, then they should have the same criteria applied to them, and having two separate systems causes confusion. So that's what we're suggesting, a review of that, to really look at the GAs and the SAs and to see the risks and what it is that we're trying to accomplish with the regulation of these things.
And to be clear, we're not asking that it be transferred to us right away. We may not be the appropriate body to transfer it to, but there should be an examination of that. And what we've laid out for you is areas that we feel are, create a concern in the work that we do.
Chair, could I just one more? Thank you for that answer. In terms of the fitness tester, is there criteria that is published and understandable other than the broad scope of are they fitted proper? Is there a public need? Is there sound economic conditions? I mean, is that the criteria, or is that specified somewhere from an applicant's perspective, so they know what they're trying to achieve or they need to achieve?
Yeah, our website and our operations, our policy manuals have guidance for the applicants. I'll turn it over to Heather to provide details.
Yeah, we're kind of in the process of modernizing the board in association with the expanded mandate. So in answer to your question, we have done all of our work on public need and sound economic conditions, and that work was specifically about that, to really explain clearly what the board means by these things and what the applicant could provide in support of that, along with regular application materials. Fit, proper, and capable is next on our list, and so right now we have reference sheets that are a little bit older that still explain to the applicant what that entails and what documentation they should be providing. But we're going to be reviewing that and updating it to make sure that it's the most transparent and clear to the applicants. Yes, there is information on all of that criteria on our website and in our policy.
All right. Other questions? Okay, Shirley.
Thank you, Chair. Apparently we can't see my little hand over there in the corner. I'll do something about that. I want to just agree with my colleague Janet that there's a lot of information here, and we're going to need to take some time with and I'm not going to ask all of my questions today. I have a number of them. I want to just ask a process question. I mean, obviously this committee is required as a result of the legislative need to review and look at changes and effectiveness. There are more than a dozen suggestions for legislative consideration. What is the process in between the reviews that take place by a special committee? I mean, when you go through the list, one of the things that I'm going to have to grapple with is what are the consequences of each one of these the suggested changes to legislation, because it's a big deal to take stuff back into the legislature and change it. And so I guess, is there an ongoing relationship with the ministry when legislative change is considered that discussion goes on along the way, so that a minister or a government could choose to amend something long before we have to wait for a mandated review by a committee.
Absolutely. And I listened in on the deputy minister's presentation, or some of it. And I have monthly meetings with the deputy minister. I also have regular meetings with the minister, and we have made suggestions for regulatory change, a change to the regulation, as well as legislative change. And that's happened in both instances where we've raised an issue that we thought needed to be addressed. For example, and I think that's discussed both, that was raised both in our presentation and in our report, the matter of making fitness the first consideration. And because right now, or before the change, the legislation was we could consider all three and then make a decision on an application, fitness, public need, and sound economic conditions. What we suggested to the minister was that, no, we should make fitness the primary consideration, and only if you pass the fitness test do we go to consider the others. And that, that came from our experience, and it came through. So we do have a very good working relationship with the ministry, and we'll continue to work with them.
Thank you for that. I have, obviously, we're going to have to take some time to think about each of the suggested legislative amendments that you've made. Just a very practical question. Our briefing note, which we received probably a month or two ago, said that there were 12 full-time staff. Your report says there are 16. Have 4 been added, or what has happened in terms of full-time staff at the PTB?
So I'll get Heather to give you the details, but just so you get a bit more of the background, in November 2020, there was an assessment made of what the core staffing was that we needed. We made a presentation to the minister, and that had and to the ministry, and that had a list of staff. It took some time for it all to come together. We had very good support from the deputy minister in the interim, but we didn't get our final approval until I think it was October 2022. So, in the meantime, until you get the stamp of approval from Treasury Board, you can't really put people into full-time positions. So Heather, do you want to add to that, please?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a challenge, and we've been ramping up as quickly as we can once we got the funding for it. So what you're seeing there is the difference, the time that it's taking to hire the staff. In particular, we didn't hire our economics and analytics team until March 2023. So we're now at capacity, but actually we have a few vacancies. But that's what the difference is us ramping up once we have the funding.
Okay. So can we expect further ramping up? On the page 40 of 40 in your report, you talk about the board being resource light in terms of economics and data analytics, currently consisting of 3 people, and the board being forced to reallocate resources from within the staffing complement. So we're looking at an evidence-based decision-making process. You've spoken at length in the report you've provided to us about the shift to not just approving licenses, but analyzing data in order to make those decisions and broader systemic decisions. So your report says that currently you are resource light in terms of the data and economics and analytics team. Can you just speak to that? And there is a specific request actually asking for additional resources. Was that part of the presentation that you made to the ministry or to Treasury Board or to somebody?
Heather, can you answer that?
So the original Treasury Board presentation, which we didn't make, it was the ministry. It was based on, the organizational review that happened in 2020. And so that entailed essentially 16 FTEs at the end of the day once we hired everybody. However, we didn't have our economics team in place yet. So we didn't really know what was going to be involved. So we fast forward to 3 years later, we now have our economics team, and they're looking at the modeling and analysis and ongoing work that needs to be done. So that's what we're saying. We only have 3 people on the team, and so we can get there, but it's going to take longer because of just the amount of work that is required to do these models and the ongoing work that's required. So that's what that's referring to. So if we had more, and I'm not talking about a lot, a few people to help in the economics and data analytics arena, we could get there faster and be able to support the board more fully in that arena.
Okay, thank you for that, Chair. I don't see any other hands, so I'll just keep going here for another couple of questions, and then I'll give some thought to the best way to ask some of these other ones at a later. I'm cognizant of our time. On page 4 of 40, the report in your report, so not in the presentation that you did, interesting comment about the amendments that were brought into force in 2019, and the comment is that it's an moving the board toward evidence-based decision making based on empirical data, and it says that the work that the work of the board that perhaps was not fully understood at that time. So can you explain to me what that means? That obviously there was a decision to move ahead, and the comment is that the work of the board was not fully understood at that time. So can you tell us what that means?
So again, I'll start, and then maybe Heather can finish. Until this change, what the board did was we would get an application, and the applicant would provide information on, demographics, their financial information, if they had letters of support from the community, and essentially and then there are submitters, they're like interveners, and generally those would be folks who'd say, no, don't do it because it's going to affect my business, or yes, do it. But beyond that, that was what the board based its decisions on. And that may have worked when we were dealing with, just taxis and, ICBs or just limos. When you introduce the TNS, you're introducing not only a new technology, but international companies with very large, huge amount of resources. And so it's no longer, I think, what the legislature was thinking, of the special committee was thinking at that time, as was the board, is that it's no longer appropriate to just rely on what the information that you're just getting from the applicant. You need to be able to have to be able to test that evidence, essentially, is what I think we're getting at. So I'm going to turn it to Heather, and this is how I conceive the way the board was at the time, and what we're expected to do now. Heather?
Yeah, I mean, in addition to that, there was sort of going from looking at each individual application to wanting to look at it within the context of the larger market, or the impact that they're going to have on a variety of things. That specific comment was related to the board undertaking the the objective evidence-based decision making based on empirical data. So at that point, so there's sort of two parts. There's the case-by-case basis versus looking at it on a systems level. But I started with the board in 2020, and I think that there was still this notion that like not quite understanding how the data was going to become evidence in the hearing. And it's more there. That's why we've elaborated on that. There's more to it than just having 90 million data points, you know, put before the board somehow. There has to be analysis. Data is not perfect. There needs to be, you know, scrubbing of the data and looking at it. I mean, you can see that with Dr. Hera's report, how he talks about all the things that he had to do in his methodology just to be able to utilize the data. And then what does this data mean? How does this relate to public need and sound economic conditions factors? So it's perhaps more complex than it was originally believed, and it requires the board to move quite significantly from what it was to where it needs to go. And so that's what that was referring to. I think that there was an understanding of what the board did at the time, but not what impact these changes would have.
Okay, I'll just ask a couple of short snappers, and then Chair, I have a pile of other questions. I'm sure others will about the specific legislative amendments that are suggested, and I'm assuming that we would want to understand the impacts of those. So I just, one quick question, and then one that I actually feel some concern about, but when we have programs like we have along Highway 16, where there is a community shuttle bus program in place, to provide for, you know, safe transportation down that corridor. Services like the health bus, which, you know, transports people from, for example, Prince George to Vancouver. Where does that fit in this whole, in the whole monitoring, assessment, effectiveness, all of those things?
So we also license intercity buses, and that is, you know, we do have a project related to that. We're very concerned about, you know, and we think we try to address that in the low density services. But that's an area that intercity buses is within our jurisdiction as well. Heather?
Yeah, this is part of the fragmentation, I think, because the health bus and some of these community shuttle programs are not under the board's jurisdiction. They're not special authorization. So there's some things that are, like ICBs or, you know, whatever is considered passenger directed, and there were some examples of that in the report, but in this particular example, the board doesn't oversee it. There's some programs that are being run through public transportation, and some of them are considered general authorizations or some other regulatory scheme.
Okay, well, I'll just make this comment, and then, you know, there's so much, you know, it's a 40-page report and with a lot of recommendations attached to it, for which we are grateful. But it does mean, I think, we have to spend some time understanding what the recommendations actually mean, and how, as you point out, what the consequences of that change might be, because that's what you've referenced in the report, that, you know, there was a decision to make a shift in direction, but there wasn't necessarily a full understanding of the implications of that. I guess I'll just end with this. I have lots of questions about the taxi host program and a bunch of other amendments that you've suggested. But on page 15 of the report, one of the things that, you know, and you've told us that one of the things you worked on was moving safety and fitness to the top of the list of considerations. And the report then speaks to the fact that, you know, the board has legal authority to examine whether an SA applicant or licensee is fit, proper, and capable, but there are numerous areas where the board lacks the tools or clear authority to assess fitness, and then suggests which could be clarified in a legislative amendment. So top priority is fitness and safety, and the report indicates that there's a lack of tools or authority. So could you speak to how you then assess fitness if you're missing tools and authority?
So what I'm going to do, thank you, Shirley. We're going to take note of that question. I know there's many others, so I think we'll go back and look at in terms of an opportunity to continue the conversation. So I'll ask
Thank
the
you.
clerk to take note of that, and just so we can keep on our schedule here. I'd like to thank members, Carmela, Heather, and also Baljinder, for your presentation, your hard work, and look forward to continuing the conversation at a future date. So thank you very much. Members, we are going to get ready and allow the clerk to have our next presenters from the Ministry of Labor come in. So we'll give a couple minutes off camera, and we'll, if you can please be back in 3 minutes at 10:37. All right, thank you. welcome Trevor Hughes, Deputy Minister for Labor, our next presenter for our briefing today. Welcome. You'll have until 11:30 for your presentation, and then to be followed by questions and answers and conversations. So thank you very much for joining us. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, members. I am in Victoria today, so I'm on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples, the Songhees, Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ. And so thought it was important to start there. Just a process question. Are you wanting me to run through the PowerPoint, or do you have it, or are you loading it? What's the process?
Okay, so the process is we have the materials. We're not
Okay.
the slide deck on the screen. So
Perfect. I can just speak to it.
And yep, speak to it.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. So good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. I wanted to give you an update at the request of your committee on the work that the ministry is doing with respect to passenger directed vehicles in terms of the work that the ministry has been doing for a number of months and that is currently underway. So the timing for this is perfect. I also do want to give an acknowledgement to Parliamentary Secretary Routledge, who's been very involved in this file, and some of the work that is going to be reflected in my presentation is a direct result of her participation and engagement. So I think it's important to lay out at the outset the context in which the Ministry of Labor exists in this space. So the ministry is a regulator when it comes to employment and labor law in the province. And we have three main statutes that are involved in this space. We have the Employment Standards Act, which deals with minimum terms and conditions of employment for employees. The Labor Relations Code, which deals with how workers become members of unions and how unions and employers interact in the collective bargaining process. And then the Workers' Compensation Act, which deals with the prevention of and compensation of workplace injuries. What's important in that description is that the ministry is not in and of itself the employer. And so as the regulator, we are responsible for some tribunals. We have the Employment Standards Branch and the Employment Standards Tribunal. We have the Labor Relations Board, and then we have the Workers' Compensation Appeal Tribunal, all of which make decisions under the statutes that apply to them. And the ministry's responsibility, of course, is to make sure those agencies have what they need to be, able to fulfill their mandate. And of course, we have the corporate relationship with WorkSafe BC, meaning government appoints the board of directors. So we have the ministers, Honourable Harry Baines. I've already mentioned our Parliamentary Secretary, Janet Routledge, but I think it's also important to mention that we had previous Parliamentary Secretary, Adam Walker, who was involved in the development of this work since 2020 or so, until he was moved to another portfolio. The hook for our work in this space is directly connected to the mandate letter that the minister and the parliamentary secretary have, which identifies a commitment to propose employment standards and other protections for app-based ride-hail and food delivery workers in BC. And I'll explain why that's particularly important as we move through the material today. So on the next slide, I've titled it the summary of the issue the ministry is exploring. And there are a couple of pieces here that are important context. One is that a lot of the workers in this sector are new to Canada. Some of them are in the process of trying to have foreign credentials recognized so they can move on to other work. There's a racialized component to the workforce, and a lot of people are working very odd schedules. Some work full-time, some do this as part-time work. And the key here is that it is work. The problem, though, is that most of the platform companies view these workers as independent contractors, meaning they're effectively self-employed. They bring their car to Uber, they bring their phone to Uber, and obviously to some of the other apps as well. That's another interesting feature of the work in this sector, is that you could be working for many platform companies all at the same time, quite literally. And so the importance of this, the notion of being classified as an independent contractor, is it means that you are excluded then from the Ministry of Labor's employment statutes. You're not covered by the Employment Standards Act. You're not eligible for a minimum wage. You're not covered by the Workers' Compensation Act, meaning if you're injured at work, say, for example, in an extreme case of a passenger assaulting you, as an Uber driver, you are not covered for workers' compensation. And the question is whether or not that should be how the statutory construct is established. Because for years, if you are an employee in a standard employment relationship, you are covered by those pieces of legislation. Yes, there are exceptions for certain occupations. For example, accountants and doctors and lawyers are excluded from the Employment Standards Act, generally because they have significantly more bargaining power than your typical non-union low-wage worker would have. And so the need for protections are not as dramatic for some of those excluded professions as they are for others that are not excluded. Similarly, there are alternate standards for a number of occupations. For example, truck drivers and taxi drivers have different standards when it comes to hours of work and overtime to reflect the unique nature of their work. The point, though, is that all of those occupations are covered. And so taxi drivers and logging truck drivers and other occupations are entitled to the minimum employment standards in the Employment Standards Act. They're entitled to workers' compensation coverage, and they're entitled to unionize because they are employees. When they're excluded and classified as independent contractors, they are not eligible for those protections. And what has happened is that a number of these workers have come forward to say, for example, I got hurt at work and I'm not covered by the workers' compensation system. I don't have any wage protection. I have no benefits. I have no access to treatment other than what I go and get through the public healthcare system, and maybe in certain circumstances have to pay for myself. And there are a number of these situations that have garnered significant public attention over the last number of months. We've seen an Uber driver who was on the front steps of the legislature, met with Minister Baines to talk about being assaulted as a driver in the Fraser Valley and not being eligible for workers' compensation coverage, and the significant impact that has had on him. There are a number of jurisdictions across the world that are reviewing this very issue, and they have all chosen a variety of different policy responses, which all leads to the question of what then should we do here in British Columbia to address the employment status of these workers and their eligibility to employment standards and other protections that traditional workers receive. Moving to the next slide. We have done a number of engagements and surveys over the last year or so, including work led previously by Parliamentary Secretary Walker and currently by Parliamentary Secretary Routledge, to engage with the sector. Everybody from people actually driving Uber vehicles, riding their bikes to deliver Uber Eats. We've met with organized labor representatives and other worker representatives. And of course, we've met with the platform companies. We've also met with a number of academics who are writing articles in this space and who are making submissions to governments across Canada, North America, and the world with respect to what other governments should be doing in this space. That led to us releasing a What We Heard report in April, and there are a number of key themes that were identified in that report through those engagements in the survey. That, believe it or not, many of the workers in this sector actually do rely on it as a primary source of income. It's not just the Monday to Friday worker who feels like doing the odd Uber shift on a Saturday that is the dominant type of worker in this sector. There is low and unpredictable income with lack of pay transparency and a lack of employer-paid workers' compensation. The lack of pay transparency is made up of a number of pieces. Workers not being clear on the basis upon which the company calculates and pays them. There's also been issues identified to us about the company not passing over tips. And there have been other questions about just general lack of pay transparency. And why that's important is, for example, under the Employment Standards Act, a worker is entitled to a pay stub with certain information every time that they are paid. We've also heard about unfair terminations where workers have been cut off of the apps without notice or without compensation and or without an appeal process. There are circumstances where drivers have been terminated because of a bad rating or low rating from a customer, which has resulted in them being summarily terminated off the app. And in some cases, the app company has reinstated them after a period of time with an investigation, but didn't provide any back pay, for example, leading to a lack of transparency in the whole process of terminations and deactivations from the apps. There is no question that there are workers who love the benefit of the flexibility of when to sign on to an app and when to sign off. You could choose to drive for 1 hour here and there, or 4 hours, or 12 hours, depending on what it is that you're interested in. And of course, the other unique nature of this work is you can literally, as I described earlier, be on multiple apps all at the same time, which of course you can see would lead to some questions about if we are to change the law in this province, the regulations and the statutory construct for this workforce. We will have to be creative at how we do it, because you have to recognize that while you might be working at McDonald's or Burger King, you're not working at them both at the same time. But you could be on the corner of Burrard and Howe. No, that wouldn't work. Burrard and Pender on 5 apps at once, waiting for a particular assignment to come your way. Another piece that we've heard about is that even from the app companies, they agree there is some value in establishing some minimum employment standards. Of course, what those are and what they would look like are subject to significant debate. And of course, the companies would like to preserve the independent status of these drivers for a number of reasons, while most of the workers and academics and labor organizations would like them to be called employees under our legislation. Just in the last few weeks, on the next slide, I outlined that we've released a discussion paper that flows from the mandate letter direction and the What We Heard report. And so this discussion paper, which was released on August 3rd, is titled Proposing Employment Standards and Other Protections for App-Based Ride-Hail and Food Delivery Workers in British Columbia. And it outlines all of the things that I've just been describing to you that we've heard so far, and provides some context for what some appropriate employment standards and other protections could be. In particular, we're focused on 4 priority areas at this time. What are fair compensation standards? So for example, how could a minimum wage be applied, recognizing you could be choosing when to work as opposed to being scheduled, and you could be on, as I used the example earlier, 5 apps all at one time. Does that mean you're entitled to 5 times the minimum wage in that space? That's not what we're thinking about, but it makes the point as to why this is a challenging area to regulate. We also want to look at pay and destination transparency. The destination transparency is important because we were told of several situations where a driver doesn't get the ability to identify where he or she might be going with a particular passenger or a food delivery until they've accepted the assignment. And that doesn't enable a worker to feel a lot of security with respect to their safety in certain assignments. And the account suspensions, deactivations, and terminations is a third area. I've described that. And then, of course, the fourth area, workers' compensation and occupational health and safety coverage, which I've described in the context of a worker who was assaulted on the job. That discussion paper is out for feedback and input until the end of this month. In addition, we are having a number of in-person or virtual sessions with some of the stakeholders that I identified we've been meeting with all along. So for example, meeting with Uber, meeting with organized labor, and meeting with workers in a roundtable later this month with Parliamentary Secretary Routledge attending and doing some introductory comments at each of those sessions. We've also, on the next slide, slide 6, we have prepared a shorter version of our discussion paper, so it's more easily digestible by workers, particularly recognizing that we have a racialized and diverse workforce. We have translated that shorter paper into 4 languages and distributed it directly to workers with whom we have engaged. We're also continuing to monitor what's going on in other jurisdictions. Just about every day, there is something about another jurisdiction that is worth having a look at. For example, we've heard about Spain. We've been watching what's been happening in Minnesota over the last few weeks, and New York City as well. It's truly a global employment standards challenge. And the final bullet on this slide, I think, is also important for your awareness. We do recognize that the ride-hail and food delivery service industry has been embraced in this province. Customers enjoy the convenience, and workers we know value the type of flexibility this work offers, particularly the ability to log on and off when they want. And so it's important for us to know, for you to know, that our work will continue to balance these considerations. And on the last slide, slide 7, I thought it was important, again, for context, for the work that we're doing and why this is such a pressing issue, are some stories over the last 12 months everything from examples of workers not being covered by the workers' compensation system. And then the last one is by Jim Stanford, an economist who's written an article about the spread of gig work and the importance of making sure these workers are not left behind. That is my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Trevor. I'll open it up to questions from committee members, and I see Shirley. I see your hand there in the corner. You're on mute, Shirley. Get that.
You'd think after years you'd be able to figure out how to get off unmute. Hey, thank you, Trevor, for your presentation. Appreciate it. I'm just first of all, for the committee, I know that we had the What We Heard report added to our resource package. I'm wondering if we have the discussion paper, and if not, if that could be added so we can actually see what people are being asked to comment on. So I'm sure that's just a matter of adding it to our resources. Trevor, you've talked about other jurisdictions that are reviewing the issue, and they have various policy responses to this. So you've mentioned obviously internationally. What about in Canada? Is there a pan-Canadian approach at looking at this? Have other jurisdictions within the country looked at this issue? And can you give us a sense of how you mentioned Spain, Minnesota, New York? Are there distinct policy decisions that have been made already to look at the issue of workplace standards? So just curious about what's happening in Canada as well.
Great, thank you, Emily Bowen. The first part of the question about Canada, only one other jurisdiction has actively done anything in this space, and it's Ontario, that passed a bill that establishes that these workers would not be employees under the employment statutes, but they would get nor would they be independent contractors. Essentially, what they've done is created a middle category that would enable them to prescribe certain conditions. For example, 120% of the minimum wage is what you would be paid for engaged time. That legislation has not been brought into effect, and there are a number of competing views about the efficacy of that type of an approach by worker groups, platform companies, and by academics. In terms of other jurisdictions across the world, there's a real mix of approaches. Some have been clearly trying to establish a minimum wage regime. Others have moved away from that kind of a system and leaving workers as independent contractors. Some have added the workers' compensation protections. Some have added other protections that are similar to Ontario's model, largely because Uber is making that kind of a push. And there are also disputes within jurisdictions. Most notably, Minnesota and New York have both tried to do something similar to the employment standards coverage, but either it's been vetoed by the mayor in Minnesota or there's an injunction in a court in New York to stop it. So there isn't really a perfect, clear approach that isn't disputed, that is easy to copy. Hope that answers your question.
It does, thank you. And it's interesting. So they simply haven't brought the bill into force because obviously there are two sides to this, you know, probably the companies on one side and the worker groups on the other. And that would explain why the middle isn't working in terms of a hybrid or a more hybrid model. So I think it's Ontario passed the bill but didn't bring it into effect. Trevor, I was also wondering about and we've heard this in the presentations this morning, that people can be working on multiple apps. And so they're, you know, do we track that? Do we have any idea that a person is working for 5 of them? I mean, when you think about people using this as a primary source of income, and so they would use multiple platforms in order to do this. So we've heard a lot about data, and they need to make decisions based on data. And yet we've also heard there's enormous gaps in data collection. So do we know if a person is working on 4 apps, and Because if you're looking at income and standards and all of those things, one would think that matters.
So it's a great question, because you've identified an area that I don't know how we would get that information. And I don't just mean we as the Ministry of Labor, because it connects to some of the things that you've described in the latter point of your question, which is income tax, because you're effectively relying on these people as independent contractors to be filing their income tax. And of course, then that's federal. So we wouldn't have any hook into that. The companies aren't employing them in the traditional relationship, so don't issue record of employment, ROE, which again is also federal. And there's no obligation to report to the province in any other context how many employers you're working for, whether you're working at McDonald's and Burger King, picking on those. Both at the same time, in the sense that you could be employed at both on different days. But we have no, and I don't know how we would ever track that. I don't know if the Passenger Transportation Board can even do that because of what their responsibilities are in that sense. We have a sense from Stats Canada the number of workers in these sectors, but we don't have an ability to know just how many are on apps at any one time. And how would we ever know that, because we don't have the connection into the company's data.
I guess that was my point, and I appreciate you sort of highlighting that, is that it's really quite unknown in terms of what people do in this sector. And I don't know whether that's good or bad, but it's just, we don't know. You referenced, my last point to the chair is you referenced the federal government and sort of their relationship through taxes and all of the other things. So in the work that you're doing, and Janet is working to support and leading, is there conversation at the federal level, considering that all the jurisdictions in our country are facing this issue? And you're right, this is a sector that has been embraced by British Columbians and by people around the world. So I always know it's complicated to, when you have to work with another level of government, but is that a discussion point at the federal level?
So short answer is yes. And in terms of some detail, I can give you 2 points. One is the feds also released a What We Heard report. The federal government released a report. They did a review of this issue in the federal sector and identified many of the same issues that we did in our What We Heard report. And then at the Ministers of Labor annual meeting in person in Ottawa in April, Minister Baines and Minister O'Regan, the federal labor minister, chaired a discussion about this in the context of, this is an issue. It's an emerging issue. It's a complicated issue. It's an issue that not every jurisdiction sees it the same way. For example, are we going to go in the same direction as Ontario? Not necessarily. And that's not a bad thing or a criticism, because there are lots of things that the provinces do differently with all kinds of things. For example, every province has a different minimum wage. But the discussion that was led by Ministers Baines and O'Regan was essentially, hey, ministers, is this something that we should be engaged in further together or not? And so that was a bit of an exploratory discussion, a chat about some of the issues and some of the challenges, and more work may be done by officials between then and the next meeting next year.
All right, okay. More questions? Janet, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Trevor, for what is a really succinct and to the point report that pretty well covers the highlights of what we've been working on and the complexities of it. And I don't really have a question. I just wanted to, speak to this. I guess primarily to using this as an opportunity to talk to the rest of the committee and say, this is like, we are really dealing with uncharted territory here. And it is, I don't think anyone in the world has gotten it right yet, but I would propose that the role of this committee and the PV, the PDV sector that we're dealing with definitely has a role to play. So I think what Trevor has talked about is looking at it from the point of view of the drivers themselves and the conditions of the drivers themselves, the rights of the drivers themselves. And I think that we do have an opportunity through this committee to talk about, regulation from the point of view of it as an industry. But as I say, uncharted territory. I look forward to some really good conversations where we can figure this out going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. Any other questions? All right. I'd like to thank you, Trevor, for your presentation, the overview in terms of that sector with respect to our considerations. And we've got a few minutes here to our next presenters. So Jennifer, I'm thinking, I mean, one option is we can give it 15 minutes, come back at 11:20, or is there any preference to come back at the 11:30, folks, and see if we can get our presenters in early? I mean, we can either, thank you, Trevor. Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to, we're going to go into recess, and we'll be back at 11:30 when we have our next scheduled presenter. So you've got 25 minutes, folks. President and CEO of ICBC. We also have Bill Carpenter, Vice President for Insurance. And do we have, here I see we've got Jason McDaniel, Vice President, Strategy and Legal. Jason, if you wanted to put your video on, that'd be great. See you here. So folks, appreciate you joining us. We have you in from 11:30 to 12:30 to start with your presentation. We don't have a slide deck, but we do have your materials that you've sent, so we can reference that if you speak to them. And then after your presentation, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. Okay, over to you, David.
Perfect. Hi there. Hello. Good morning, almost afternoon to everybody. As you say, my name is David Wong. I go by the pronouns he, him, and joined by Bill and Jason from ICBC as well. We are coming to you from the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Very excited to be here today to speak to this committee and talk about how ICBC is a key contributor to the success of the safety of the passenger-directed vehicle transportation. As you said, you have the deck, so really what I was planning to do is just do some highlights, and I'll just reference the slide I'm working through, and then we can have some questions at the end. So I start with the key messages. I want to leave you with three things. Hopefully you'll see that as we go through this discussion. First is that ICBC understands that we are an important stakeholder to the success of the passenger-directed transportation in BC. Second is that we have been there from the very beginning, and we will continue to support government, this board, the industry, and British Columbians as you expand the service across the province. And third, that the ecosystem we continue to be actively involved in the ecosystem. I just want to say personally, I have used ride-hailing services quite a bit, particularly in the Lower Mainland, and it gives me comfort of all the work that's being done here, and that I can get in knowing that I'm in a safe and protected vehicle as I get my drive around the city. So flipping to the next slide, I really want to talk about how ICBC contributes in two critical ways in delivering the service to British Columbians. And that's through our insurance, and I see that as protection, and driver's licensing, and I see that as the qualification process. And so the qualification is really important because it provides the rigor so that everyone knows that they can feel safe when they get into a vehicle, and those who are using the roads are well safe. And we have the protection in place so that if something were to happen to the vehicle or to individuals, that they are protected for recovery thereafter. So I'll walk through both of those. We'll start with the insurance, and then we'll move over into the driver's licensing. And so on the protection side and insurance, we've had our product, and that was in place from September 16, 2019, so just prior to where the first TSN was approved. So we had the products in place, rates in place at the very beginning. Just want to identify two unique characteristics related to this product. One is that when the insurance product is being used while on a drive for a passenger, if any claim were to occur, it actually doesn't impact the driver's record, but it has just the impact to the corporate TSN policy. Second really interesting thing is that this is our first product where we did driver-based, or I should say kilometer-based insurance rates. So we're really excited that we were able to bring out this product. And actually, many of you may know that we now have another product for personal drivers, which is if you drive less than 15,000 kilometers, you get a discount. So continuing to expand that. On the next slide, it's called How Distance-Based Products Work. We just kind of give a graphic around how the insurance is supporting the driver, both while they're on a ride and while they're waiting for a ride. So if you take a look on the left-hand side where we see TSN products, TNS products, while the driver is waiting or off service, that's going to be covered under their own insurance policy. And then you can see when the driver is being hailed, the app, they accept the ride, they're off and driving towards the customer for pickup, and then they're actually taking the customer on the ride. That's all covered under the company TSN insurance policy. And that premiums are associated, as I mentioned, by the distance driven there. What we wanted to also show you in this slide is that we're trying to create a level playing field between the TSN products, TNS products, and the taxi product. And so for taxis, we have a similar product where while they're driving, it can be distance-based as well. But we also have the flat rate product for them as well, in case I wanted to continue with that. So that really keeps them on a level playing field. Okay, so then switching to the next slide, I think you've seen numbers from Modi, but the number of TNS policies are continuing to increase. Just as of July 2023, you were seeing that we're about 11,000 policies out there. And so there's a continued demand for these licenses, insurance policies, as we continue to see more vehicle hail rides being provided in the province. I think an interesting one, and this is you take a look at the next slide, from a claims perspective, while we're seeing claims are increasing, that does reflect the fact that there are more passenger vehicle directed drivers on the road, but we're not seeing accident rates increasing. So number of claims per kilometer driven isn't increasing. And so that's an important thing that we're taking a look at from a safety perspective. Okay, so shifting from there, we're going to move to driver's licensing. I'm going to ask you to go to the second slide that's titled driver's licensing. And again, this is really important from a qualification, process, and safety perspective. And we want to ensure that everyone who is driving one of these vehicles is provided in a safe way, that people who are getting into the vehicles can feel safe, and those who are using the roads and being pedestrian cyclists are also feeling safe as well. And so that means we want to have a very rigorous qualification and review process before someone gets a license to do this. And so what we are using is a Class 4 license, Class 4 driver's license. It can also be called like a commercial driver's license. And you can see on this slide that there is a pre-qualification even before you can even go into the test. And so I think it's important to highlight what these are. So you need to have a full BC's driver's license. Class 5 is the thing that most of us have when we are driving a car, or Class 6 in the case you're a motorcycle driver. It can be even from out of the province. You have to be at least 19 years of age. You have to have a 2 years minimum post-learner's period of driving experience. Less than 4 penalty points in over the last 2 years. And importantly, no criminal record or convictions over the last 3 years. So we go through that process, we're making sure that they are all being addressed. And then you move into the 3-part screening testing period before you can actually get the license as well. So for the pre-screening portion, that's where we need to get a medical examination as well we do a criminal record check. For people from Canada or the US, we can probably do that once we get the information within a matter of minutes. For international drivers, it will take about 15 to 20 business days to complete that review. And I know that it's important that we continue to get international drivers getting the commercial licenses to support our economy. What we have seen is since the introduction of the passenger-directed vehicles, a 50% increase in the demand for Class 4 licenses. So we're definitely seeing that people are looking to us to support that. Just wanted to give you some statistics and data. And again, I think that this is consistent with some of the other information that you have seen in prior presentations. But on the Class 4 knowledge test by year slide, you can see that the numbers are increasing over the last 5 years significantly. And obviously, I think you've heard the Lower Mainland and Southern Interior being the biggest areas where we're getting the largest demand for tests. I think a really interesting part of this data is that the pass rate is below 50%. And it's not unusual. We're seeing this consistently with all the types of knowledge tests that we provide. And we are really encouraging people to spend the time, learn, study before they come and do the tests. On the next slide, you can see the Class 4 road test. So now that after they get to the knowledge test, they have to go through the road test. Again, the numbers are very consistent. We see the increases in demand, and again, the lower mainland southern interior. And again, the pass rate is slightly, in this case, below the 50%. What this is actually doing, of course, is that it is taking away from, or taking time, because we have to put people through the tests again. So it does create a capacity issue. So it's something we've been thinking a lot about and how to address that. But definitely one of the ways we're doing, and in general for our regular Class 5 driver licenses as well, we are doing media. We're trying to get out there, informing people, if you can get to a driving school, please do that. Make sure that you're taking the time to follow all the skills that need to be done before you show up to the test, because that certainly will help in the capacity perspective. But of course, we want to get the drivers out there as quickly as possible. So on this last slide, you can see we're looking at wait times. And since COVID, the wait times had gotten much higher. We have done a lot of work to be able to get those wait times down. We're now to around the mid 20 days. And things that we've done to do that is we've reduced the time for the regular Class 5 driver's license, the tests themselves, the road tests. Reduce that by 10 minutes, from 45 minutes to 35 minutes, without reducing the quality or the integrity of the test. But that's going to increase capacity for the commercial road testing. We've opened up new facilities. We've added additional appointments, particularly on weekends, and we've hired more driver examiners as well. So the whole ecosystem has allowed us to get that wait times down quite significantly. So I think I will end there by saying that we hope that we've provided you with some more information about how ICBC continues to support the success of the passenger vehicle directed vehicles in the province. We want to ensure the safety of British Columbians. We want to provide affordable protection, and that we are definitely an important part of this ecosystem. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for your presentation, David. I'll open it up to questions from committee members. Kelly, go ahead.
Thanks. I just have a couple of clarification questions, please. On the distance-based products page, where there's the owner's basic policy and the company's blanket basic policy, are you referring to the, like, say, Uber's basic policy, or are you referring to if the car is owned perhaps by the individual through a company, because sometimes they incorporate and hold assets that way to protect themselves?
I think Phil might be the best one to answer that one.
Yeah, I can answer that. It would be Uber's, or the other, whoever's providing the TNS service. It would be their policy that covers in. We call the different phases A, B, C, and D. So C and D are when C is when you're on your way to pick up a passenger, and D is when you have the passenger and you're delivering them to their destination. And so that's the policy for that Uber would have and cover in those situations.
Okay, thank you for that. And then how does the driver pay for that portion of the insurance, or is that insurance paid for by Uber? I'm unclear on how that works.
Uber pays for that, and so then I think what the driver gets paid is that they don't get all of that fare. Uber collects that and then pays the driver a portion of that, reflecting all their costs, including what they have to pay for insurance.
Thank you. And my very last clarification question, thank you for entertaining me, is the driver licensing slide, the prerequisites to getting the Class 4. If at some point after they've got the Class 4 and they incur more penalty points or have a driving related criminal conviction, what happens then? Is it just something that's picked up at the next time they need to renew, or is there a more interim process?
I think that one's for me. Jason might add something to it, but we keep different driving records. So we keep one for your personal use, and we keep one for your business use, and so kept separately. So if the question is, would somebody stops driving as a TNS driver, then that whatever experience they had there is separate from their personal experience, but just the personal experience would affect it going forward.
That's so these are prerequisites, as you flagged rightly. To get a class 4 license, you can't have any more than 4 points. You can't have criminal convictions in the three prior years. That gets you the license. That is, unless you lose the license or apply for a renewal, that's not going to get captured. A conviction doesn't, there's no process or system that leads to a conviction leading to the pulling immediately of the class 4 driver license. But if you ever needed to reapply, you would be caught at that time. There is a driver improvement review process as well. So if you have multiple points, you could be triggered for a review at that stage, and that could impact your licensing requirement if that happens.
Thanks, appreciated.
Janet? Thank you. I just want to follow up on a previous question, make sure I understand. So if I understood the answer correctly, it's the company that pays for the policy, and then they charge it back to the driver. So ICBC is paid by the company, and then the company gets paid by the driver for their ICBC coverage.
I don't, it's not a dollar for dollar. I think when, it's a question for Uber really, or Lyft or whoever's providing the service, but if they're going to pay the driver something, and, it takes into account it would take into account all of the, I'm assuming all the business expenses that Uber would have. And then, so it's really, it's not a dollar for dollar thing where it's deducted for that specific driver, as I understand.
Okay, but just again, to make sure I understand. So say compared to, say, workers' compensation, where the employer pays a premium, they don't charge that back to the employee who's being insured. So this is quite a different system. Is that right?
Well, they're not charging
or it's
back.
open-ended.
Well, I don't know. It's a question for Uber, but so I'm making. Probably shouldn't be making an assumption, but I'm assuming they set what they pay their driver, that takes into account all the expenses, that the business expenses that they have, and insurance is one of those expenses. But they don't know specific. There isn't a charge for that specific driver. It's not deducted for that driver.
Okay. All right.
Can I maybe clarify? I'll add a little to that. It's not a direct chargeback. It is, they have to pay the premiums, and they have salaries for drivers. What they compensate driver factors in that to make sure they're still making a profit, but they're not flowing the direct cost of insurance back to the drivers, but indirectly, the assumption is driver's salary reflects what Uber is paying, so that Uber's still making a profit with that's the assumption. They're making a profit, considering both the premiums and the amount they pay the driver.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Shirley.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for your time spent with us this morning. There was a report in 2023 by Dr. Hera, who pointed out the fact that there are significant shortages of drivers in the passenger transportation industry. And so then we look at knowledge tests and actually completion successfully, neither one of which is over 50%. So one would wonder if we actually had people, and I'm not suggesting we change the standards to allow anyone to drive, but that obviously would be a contributing factor to the shortage of drivers if you can't pass the test. Has ICBC done an analysis of why first of all, the pass rate on the knowledge test is so low? And we're talking about in 2022, it was 35%. teachers would be asking themselves, what are we doing here that it's 35%? And the pass rate is only 45%. So I absolutely want stringent expectations, but has ICBC analyzed why we've seen a drop? In 2018, it was 61% in terms of the pass rate on the knowledge test, and just flip the page, and it was 55% on the road tests. So can you tell me what you've learned about why that's happening?
Yeah, it's a very good question. We have seen a big drop. Now we are, most people, over 70% on both the knowledge test and the road test are through after the second test. So by after the second test, we're over 70%. But the drop, there's a few factors. One is way more people with the introduction of passenger directed transportation are moving, and the theory, one of the theories is one of the primary causes a lack of preparation. You know, class 4 road tests are different. There's a pre-trip check you have to do, go around the vehicle and a number of things. Same with the knowledge test. People maybe have been driving many, many years and assume they can pass the knowledge test without putting in the effort and work. So we think the rush of new folks moving into this new field is a big contributor for it. We've also looked at pass rates in the private passenger area. We have some regions with lower pass rates than other regions, and there are a few contributing factors, including preparation. Language barriers can be one. It's one we're looking at right now. Commercial testing, unlike private passenger testing, is currently only provided in English, and I think that is a long-standing policy, but one and not unique, but one we're actively looking at right now to see whether that is critical for commercial vehicles. It's separate. Passenger vehicles, as you likely know, can be done. The knowledge test can be done in multiple languages, or you can have a translator, but we don't do that for commercial testing to date. But I think there's an opportunity. There is an opportunity that we're actively looking at to revisit that right now.
Okay, so I certainly with a higher number of people, you can imagine that would probably contribute. I was going to raise the issue of language barriers, and I'm not suggesting what it should be one way or the other when it comes to commercial, but it's important that ICBC is looking at that work to see what is happening there, because the numbers have taken a substantive drop, and I don't think they can entirely be linked to the fact that more people are taking the test. So I think that there's good reasons for analyzing that. We certainly saw, we appreciated, although it took some time to deal with, for example, Ukrainian people who arrived in our communities and needed help on that front. And so I'm glad to see that's been worked on. Interestingly enough, you break down the road tests and you include North Central as one of the regions. And then when you flip the page over, where we're talking about wait times for class 4, and yes, it's coming down, but we will note that on the chart that talks about knowledge test wait times, North is not represented at all. North, I guess the closest would be the southern interior. Can you just speak to the availability of testing in rural communities? Because we're already challenged to make sure that we have transportation opportunities in these communities. So there's no connection to the fact that people are taking the test. And certainly we have dealt with many situations where there's been huge long delays for people who live in other parts of British Columbia who also have need. So can someone speak to the issue of rural British Columbia and availability of testing?
Yeah, when it comes to road tests, our challenges and problems are fairly consistent in all regions for road tests, the average wait times, which are going down significantly. But there isn't drastic regional difference for road test times. Counter knowledge test times are very much a regional story, though, with sort of lower mainland Fraser Valley, the longest, and sometimes it is more micro than that. So Guildford and Metrotown have the longest waits for those appointments versus even other locations in the Lower Mainland. As I look at the chart, I think the knowledge tests that we're doing by year, you're right, is the average, the wait time isn't captured there. I can get it. It is not higher than Fraser Valley and Greater Vancouver. I can say confidently, but I don't have the reason. Maybe even before the questions are done, I can get an answer for you for what it is. But it isn't the outlier. I'm confident of that the Lower Mainland, Fraser Valley are the outliers for those wait times.
Okay, I appreciate that. I mean, it is a big province, and what I'm trying to get at is the fact that, you know, when we talk to the Passenger Transportation Board and we talk about equity and, you know, provision of services, we are talking about a big province. So my question is, if you live in Smithers or Telkwa or Clearwater or Cranbrook, what are the challenges in getting a Class 4 license? What are the wait times? And, you know, it is a big province. We're not reflected there at all. And yet, you know, what's important is analyzing what it's going to take to have equity. We know, we live here. We know that it's, you know, never going to be, we're not ever going to be probably at par, but the point is it's not reflected in this information at all. It's broken down when it comes to pass or fail rates. So I would just appreciate some follow-up information on the perspective for rural British Columbians. Are the waits longer? Where do they have to go? Because all of that contributes to people's willingness to participate in an industry where we actually need more drivers, and we need to be looking at diverse options where we live as well. So thank you, Chair. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'd look forward to that follow-up information.
Yeah, and I just like to say that, I mean, I appreciate the question. We'll get the follow-up information that ICBC is definitely, rural communities are important, and we're looking at ways to support and continue to enhance that support in the rural areas.
And I'll just add, David, the wait times for counter and knowledge tests in the north, very short. So I've just had that confirmed. They are in the, you know, in the 1 to 3 day kind of category for the counter knowledge tests. I don't have the specific road test information, but they're very short for those appointments.
If I could, Chair, I want to emphasize the road test piece. Where can you take them? How long? It's different if you have to drive 250 miles to get a Class 4 driver's test on the road. So my point is, you know, what is the level of service that's provided in a, you know, geographically 2/3 of British Columbia? So thank you.
All right. Okay, so we'll get back with that information. Jordan. You're on mute there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to reinforce MLA Bond's comments on rural BC, and it's not so much wait times as access to commercial the road tests. They're far less available than the Class 5 tests. And there's often times where you are required to travel several hundred kilometers to do the test, and especially if you need a particular vehicle to do that, it creates a real barrier. I think we need to recognize. Oh, okay. One question on pass-fail rates. How do you compare the pass-fail rates on a Class 5 versus a Class 4? Are the rates similarly challenged?
They're a little over 50% for the Class 5, sort of the road tests and knowledge tests. So that dip, the dip we've seen in the last few years down to 35%, that is an outlier. That is, you know, we've always and traditionally been around the 50% pass rate, and that sticks out as lower than for other tests.
Okay.
Specific to 2022. It's a little bit higher already this year than that 35%, but it's still lower than the others.
In terms of the original TNS and taxi recommendations from the Standing Committee several years ago, it was actually a unanimous recommendation of the committee to allow for Class 5 licenses for TNS and taxis. And the decision was made, government chose not to implement that recommendation, as you know, and go to a Class 4 license. Is there any evidence or is there any data to suggest that a Class 4 driver is safer, or there's some evidence that the having a Class 4 barrier makes a difference in terms of road safety, recognizing, of course, that all the other prerequisites could be put in place without a requirement to get a Class 4 driver's license. Like, you still could have a medical exam, you could still need to have a criminal record check, but you don't, I guess my question is, does requiring a Class 4 license make you a better driver?
Bill, I'll start, but from a sort of claims experience side, there's a good driver. No easy answer to that question, I would say. It is things like the pre-trip check that we do for other commercial vehicles, so ambulance drivers, paramedics, it lines up with the testing we do for those types of roles and functions as well. And so there's more rigor in it. And to the extent that you've established your ability to you have to prove you have more knowledge and ability. How does that translate to accident rates? I think is a complex question. I don't know, Bill, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I don't know if we have Class 4 compared to Class 5, because you have to take into account distance, and that's relatively new for us. We do know that people who fail and you look at their experience later is not as good as those who pass on the first time. So, if we were letting 100% of these drivers, I don't know how many come through eventually, that would be worse than the profile that we're getting now. I can't say that.
All right. Okay. Any other further questions, comments from committee members? All right. I'd like to thank you, David, Bill, Jason, for your presentation, answering our questions. We appreciate that. And so thank you for spending the time with us today.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Have a good afternoon.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, so that concludes our presenters today. I know we will get back in terms of more opportunities to continue discussion on presentations. So we'll get back to committee members on that. Is there any further business from anyone? Seeing no further business, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn. Okay, so a second. All those in favor? All those opposed? Okay, thank you. Meeting is adjourned.